Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ashok Strategic Research Center online seminar co-hosted with Hamad bin Khalifa University. The panel aims to discuss the outcome of a year-long research by the Political Islam in the second wave of the Arab Uprisings Task Force that examines the political position and behavior of the Islamic movements during the 2019 protest wave in Algeria, Iraq, Sudan, and Lebanon. So the format of the session today will be the keynote speech by none other than the distinguished Professor Imad Shaheen. It will be for a 20-minute speech, followed by 10 to 15-minute window for presentation by our speakers. And after that, we will have our Q&A session. I think we will take questions one by one, and I can take also questions in Arabic and translate if needed. I'd like to welcome you all and give the floor to Dr. Imad Shaheen, who is the interim provost of Hamad bin Khalifa University and the dean of College of Islamic Studies, Qatar Foundation, CIS. He holds a PhD from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and he has taught in leading universities in the United States, including Harvard, Notre Dame, Georgetown, and Boston University. Before further ado, Dr. Imad Shaheen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rawan, for this kind introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Let me just start by giving due and extend due thanks, of course, to the organizers, Sharq Forum and Sharq Strategic Research, in particular, Mr. Muhammad Affan, for his kind invitation, for inviting me to be a participant in this wonderful, with this wonderful group and distinguished guests and panelists. I also would like to extend my thanks to our professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University, Professor Evren Took, who has been instrumental in forging collaboration that we really cherish with Sharq Forum, and in all, inshallah, all its entities. And we really hope that this will be a long and profound cooperation between the two entities, Hamad bin Khalifa University and the Sharq as well. And we are just, finalizing now a memorandum of understanding that just will provide a legal or whatever framework for our collaboration. But as you have seen, our collaboration had already started, and we're looking forward to cementing and enhancing it in all its aspects. Because for us, Sharq is very important, especially in the objectives and the message that it's trying to achieve. I'm also honored to be part of this distinguished panel and among this wonderful group of researchers and scholars. Just not to waste further time, in my 20 minutes, I will try to share some reflections on the main topic of this panel, which is Islamic political movements after the second wave of the Arab Spring. I'm sure our outstanding panelists will focus on specific case studies, which for me is the right approach to handle this phenomenon, and not to give wide generalization, but allow me to do the opposite. And since they are going to focus on case studies, I will just give an overview that will focus on a number of issues. One, of course, is the context in which Islamists are currently operating and the challenges that this context pose to them. The second theme that I'm going to focus on is I will try to see where the Islamist movements are within this context and how they are corresponding to the changes that are taking place. And as you will see from the different papers that are going to be presented, it's really a very fast and rapid pace of change with very complicated surroundings, internal, regional, external, international. So they have to cope with all this. Then I will address 5 areas that require special attention. And by attention, I mean on the part, of course, of the Islamists themselves or the Islamic political movements, in order to assume a positive role or a proactive, let's call it proactive role in the near future. So 5 areas. One, of course, is the state-society relations. And the second area is governance model. The third one is internal or intra-movement challenges. The fourth one is policy making and policy implementation. And finally, regional and international level. I will try just to very briefly touch on these in terms of the challenges and how the Islamists are expected to respond to these challenges. Finally, I will conclude with common features that whether, no matter how well or poorly the Islamists will respond to the above areas or the above challenges, these are common features that these movements will share in the post-Arab Spring, whether it's the first wave, the second wave, and later on, regardless of how they deal with the above issues. So in terms of the context, I will just try just to time myself because this can take forever. But in terms of the context itself, I think the context in general, whether it applies to Islamists or otherwise, it's characterized by lack of an institutionalized state. Again, I'm not going to go into the background and historical frameworks in 20 minutes, but I think what we see now is a garrison state. There are types of states, but a garrison state where the military seems to be the state holder. This is in one type, not all of them. It's hard to generalize, but seems the military or the garrison seems to be the institution or the lever that holds the entire system. And we have seen that in so many statements, even if the facade is a civilian facade, but actually deeply, it is the military as an institution, as opposed to a party, as a state, as opposed to a bureaucracy and so on, that it is holding either the political balance or the economic and social balance, poorly again or positively. The second, of course, lack of institutionalized is, of course, the monarchical state or the monarchical system, whether it is historical, and we have different cases of the historical monarchies, or tribal. That it is really building its solidarity on the tribal bond that keeps the state together. Finally, of course, a state that's suffering from a fragile balance of sectarianism, regionalism, and factionalism. There are other types, but generally speaking, if you look around you, this is the part of the context that the Islamists or the Islamic political movements have to respond to and to be dealing with. So the lack of institutionalized state. The second issue is the conflictual and not consensual political culture. This is very important, and we have seen it actually in the Arab Spring and how it started to unfold into phases from the second wave into the from the first wave to the second wave. That there is an issue with the dominant political culture. Low capacity, that's characterized by low capacity to resolve conflicts in a peaceful or non-violent manner. And we have seen, of course, the civil wars, the factionalism that's taking place and erupting into wars and actually a zero-sum game. The second issue of the political culture, or this negative political culture, of course, is the political differences turn into existential conflicts and severe polarization that are characterized by mistrust, low associational life, and inadequate collective and organizational action. I hope these are self-explanatory because I want to get into the crust of the presentation itself. This is like an introductory, again, environment or context, but it's the issue of turning political differences that exist in every society. Every society is polarized and there are divisions and everything, but at least there is a system to resolve these differences and not turn them into a zero-sum game by which one side tries to eliminate or eradicate the other side. The third negative aspect, of course, is the inexperience of the main agents in coalition building and in governance in general, in managing these crises and in managing this political culture to reach some kind of common or consensual grounds. Again, I'm touching very generally speaking. Third is the close interconnectedness of the old and new. And this is part of the context that we are all living. There have been an Arab Spring, popular uprisings that are calling for change, calling for reform. And this reform, or let's say now the aspiration for, or the dream about reform is being expressed, articulated side by side with very old structures that are really very hard to die. They are not dying out. And I usually use this analogy. It's because the reform is expected to take place while the process is unfolding. Like the process is changing on very rapid and very quick pace. At the same time, we are expecting to introduce these reforms in a kind of a manageable way. I give always this analogy of trying to fix a train while it's moving full speed, and at the same time it needs repairs, and it's moving full speed, and it needs to stop on different stations to, you know, like board passenger and onboard passenger, and at the same time you have to start or to do this idea or this issue of fixing, the process of fixing, which is very difficult. But this is unfortunately the situation that we're facing. It's not, you know, something stagnant. No, it's something that's really moving very quickly, and you have to always have your tools and being able to fix while things are unfolding and moving. Old structures are very well, I think it's becoming obvious, are very well entrenched and die hard, especially in its implementing aspects, the state bureaucracy and the security apparatus, whether it's the military or the intelligence and so on. These are really very difficult to uproot, or at least to reform, or even to reform. Then finally, with the interconnectedness of the old and new, is the issue of the fear of the uncertain on most of the population, on the numbers, on the masses themselves. This idea of masses weighing to the side of stability, to the side of stagnation, to the side of security, and even to the side of authority. And we have seen this. So this is all part of the context in which not only the Islamist political movements and other political movements have to deal with and have to respond to. Also, these characteristics provide some kind of an impetus, a drive for change and a need for reform, whether it is the old order. You need to reform if you are adopting some kind of a gradualist, reformist approach, or a totally revolutionary process to eradicate the old order and establish a new order in its place. Now, where is the Islamists, or where are the Islamists in this context and in this process? I think the Islamists in general, Islamic political movements, are currently faced with deep and multiple stigmas. The first, of course, the stigma is some kind of a perceived responsibility that is being put on the part of the Islamists for the failed revolutions. They are always dubbed as not revolutionary enough, not inclusive enough, and I will touch on this again. But this is one perception, that they were not really weighing to the side of the revolution because they are not revolutionary. They were trying to make deals all the time and so on, or trying to side with the status quo and with the regime, getting into some kind of form of very ineffective governments and governance. And in the end, nothing is changing and nothing is being reformed. So this is one major feeling or perception of the responsibility of the Islamists on the maintaining or what's happening or what has happened. The second one, of course, is the again accusation of being great in squandering excellent opportunities. They came to power in some cases. We're not going to argue whether this was with full authority or not full authority and so on, but they came to power. They participated in governments or participated in the parliaments and so on and so forth. However, they missed the opportunity to induce effective change into the system. A third, of course, issue that where the Islamists are in this is, of course, the Islamists, most of them right now, or the mainstream, let's call it, the mainstream are being targeted by the counter-revolutions, being suppressed, being tarnished in terms of their reputation, their image, and their appeal within society itself, especially the mainstream ones that can or they used to attract some kind of following and large numbers. Now, in addition to this, the Islamists also are kind of, or have to deal with the whole process of radicalization of political Islam in some cases, and the image of, for example, ISIS and the atrocities that have been committed, and of course, the use of this kind of aberration, distorted model as a boogeyman for to scare other people or the respective countries, and also as a scary or a scaring tactic that this is the scary alternative that Islamists, if they come to power, are going to implement and so on. And then finally, of course, and this is especially after the second wave or the Arab Spring, is the perceived failure that the perceived failure of the Islamic movement caused some kind of a shock at the personal level, and even the psychological level on the part of so many, especially young people, and not even young, I mean even other old, in terms of steering away from Islam, not only from political Islam, but steering away from Islam. And we see a lot of the trends of unveiling among women, or some women, for example, or the trend of the spread of atheism as a kind of a trend now that's becoming or spreading. All right, all these, of course, led many analysts, of course, to talk about the failure of political Islam, the irrelevance of political Islam and political Islamic movements in the future, because they got discredited. They are becoming increasingly irrelevant. They are becoming something of the past. So, and at best now people talk about, or analysts talk about, the post-political Islam or post-Islamism or whatever they talk about in terms of the state of passé of political Islam. I just want to remind here of a book that came in 1998 by Olivier Roy, The Failure of Political Islam. That was more than 20 years ago, in which again he predicted the failure of political Islam. But this is really a big issue, and I'm sure in the 60s also some other people, like when they anticipated any change, James Bill, for example, in Iran, he counted on, or he predicted, or Fred Holiday also, he predicted that the communists are going to take over in Iran. James Bill predicted that the liberals and the followers of Mossadegh the liberals were going to take over in Iran, and nobody counted the Islamic mullahs and the religious trend as a viable option, because for them it was a failing option and it was something of the past. So this is really a very kind of, but it's very interesting. It's a very interesting point, how to measure the success or failure of a movement, and how can we define this failure and success in a dynamic way. It is not hinged on a static objective or static objectives, set of static objectives. For example, coming to power as a criterion. I always give this example of Afghani and Muhammad Abdo, Jamal ad-Din Afghani and Muhammad Abdo, and how would you assess their movement? Has it failed? If you measure it against their declared objectives, has it failed? Has it succeeded? And so on. If you look at the Arabi, they were behind the Arabi revolt, and the Arabi revolt led to the occupation of Egypt, and this as a pretext, of course, and this and that, and all that. Even the reform movement led to a different trajectory of a secular, liberal, constitutional, and very away, and even westernizing trend. Was that a failure or a success if we look at it in a kind of a comprehensive criteria? I'm really sorry, but I have to move very quickly. And I asked or I will ask Rawan 5 minutes before my time is up, if she can alert me so I can wrap up as quickly as possible.
Actually, right? Yeah, we have 5 minutes left, unfortunately.
No, don't worry. I'm used to teaching, so I can wrap it up in 5 minutes. All right, so now, if we look at this now, in the introduction, I referred to 5 areas that needs addressing from the Islamic political movement. The first one is, of course, the state-society relations, and this is, and the second one is the governance model, the internal or intra-movements challenges, and the policy making and policy implementation, and then the regional and international levels. And their progress on these elements, these components, is actually is going to offer them excellent opportunities in the future. And their failure also will make them stagnate or become, just increasingly as any other political party or any other alternative. Now, the state-society relations, I think, the Islamists have for long considered the state as the vehicle to introduce or induce change. They talk about Islam, Deen wa Dawla, and so on, and the amplification of the state as a vehicle through which the individual can be delivered, or combining both, as you will see. So the state is a necessary component or requirement for establishing or implementing the Islamic project. However, in the end, we found out that there was no Islamic project that's kind of clear or coherent. So that was, of course, a major issue, or is a major issue that needs to be addressed. Related to this, of course, is understanding the nature of the state that they would like to establish itself. So knowing the Arab state, aside from the imagined Islamic state, the Arab state is informal, which is very difficult to understand, of course, because of its informal nature. It's deep. It is like a black box in many cases. And it's in part self-automated, whether there is a leader, not a leader. There is some kind of a self-automation here that has to be figured out. How, we're talking about, for example, the bureaucrat who is, grade 5 or grade 4 and so on, that can, stall the entire process and so on. So there is, in this case, a new narrative, a fresh narrative about the state, the Arab state in general, and the Islamic state in that respect. The second one is the model of governance. Now we have seen, of course, Islamists coming to power through 5 different models. A revolutionary model, the Iranian model, an Islamist model that came through a military coup, Sudan, and failed, and turned into a highly authoritarian. Both of these turned into highly authoritarian. An Islamic model that came following an outside invasion, Afghanistan and Iraq. An Islamic model that came following the collapse of a state, Somalia, and then an Islamic regime that followed a free and democratic electoral process. The AK Party, the Malaysia case, the Indonesia, Hamas, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, and so on. All these were different cases of, and all these had varying degrees of success or failure. So it is very important to establish, basic, essential political science facts that, the way you come to power will determine your performance, and actually, to some extent, the degree of your success. And in the post-Arab Spring, of course, if you add all this up, the problem becomes compounded because it needs now concerted efforts. We know that the state is really a failing state and is very difficult to manage by one faction alone, and also that even the task of ruling is very, very, very complicated. The third area, the area of approach to change, which was always a bottom up, in order to reach the state, and then the state will change again or implement the required changes and so on. There is, of course, a lot of question marks here about, the dawah approach versus the dawla approach, and then how you can separate between the two, and whether it's good to separate or not. And we have seen it, this kind of, there is really a tough balance to strike here between the two, because you need always to balance between a gradualist approach, bottom up, and then a revolutionary approach, state top down. And of course, you cannot please, either the left of center or the right of center in that process. The policy making challenge. I think this is if there is an essential point in this, this is the most important point in this presentation, and this is the need really to transform from politics to policies. The need of the Islamic political movements to transform themselves from politics to policy. It doesn't mean that these are mutually exclusive, but the mentality, the state of mind has to focus more on policies, solutions to the existing problems of society. People do not, as you have seen it, people, and even your involvement in the process, your religiosity does not give you some kind of a green light that you will have some credit over others. It doesn't appear so, and it doesn't seem to be so. People need people, or those who can, or the elites who can solve their problems. So how will that be manifested? It will be manifested in a genuine transformation into some aspect or certain aspects of the Sharia into policies, renewal of the maqasid, renewal of the mafahim, in order to address the current needs of society. I just need like a couple of minutes. Then also the need to have a coherent, very coherent views on certain issues at the policy level. We're talking here about structural crises in society at the broadest level. At the broadest level, national integration, state building, coexistence, inclusiveness, all of this need economic reform, social justice and growth, corruption, equality, public liberties, inclusiveness. You need to have a formulation of policies, your own policies regarding this, all these issues. Finally, the final area or the fifth area is foreign policy challenge, and there are actually two major points here. One is the Islamic worldview. And the Islamic worldview, you cannot deny it, you cannot suppress it, because Islam has its own worldview. It looks to the world from a certain perspective. It is our understanding of that worldview that has to be clarified. And in this case, our worldview as an Islamic worldview is a counterweight. It is not a conflictual one necessarily, but is a counterweight and not a combatant. Is a counterweight to the other, but not a combatant other. We are not in a state of belligerence all the time, a state of hostility all the time. But we need at the same time to produce an attractive model or appeal or a call to humanity in general. There are attempts from an ethical point of view, humanitarian point of view, and there's a lot of literature that could be incorporated into the body of the Islamic political movement. Now, there is also a need to redraw the regional map. You see, these are big, major tasks, by the way. But unfortunately, the Islamists, unlike the others, because this worldview, they have to come up with these things: how to deal with the regional map and what kind of objectives, strategic objective that they need to achieve, while also looking at the West from this kind of dilemma. And that's my own undertaking or assignment. This idea of how to deal with this hegemony versus self-determination. This is all. If you look at our history for the past 200 years, this is what it boils to: hegemony versus self-determination. Now, to conclude, and I'm going to conclude, regardless of how the Islamists in the future will deal with all these issues, there are common developments that we should expect in the post-Arab Spring. Second wave, first wave or second wave. One, we should expect a pluralistic political Islam within the mainstream Islam itself. It's not the Muslim Brotherhood alone, or the Nahda alone, or it's Adala wa Tanmiya or whatever. No, within the mainstream political Islam, you are now increasingly, you will see a lot, because of the politicization and because of the opening of the political spectrum itself. This is the nature of things. There is a space, forces will fill this space. So there is as a result of this pluralism, there will be proliferation. There will be proliferation of new versions of political Islam all the time, as a result either of splits or revision or stress, social strains, or whatever. But there will always be proliferation of new versions of political Islam, which is a healthy sign. It doesn't mean, that this is kind of, like this integration and the fragmentation of all this. No, because again, we will reach to a mainstream at some point. We as societies, acting as professional political parties. Like now we'll see the mainstream Islamists and Islamic political movement will start acting as a professional political parties. Pragmatism, calculations, coalition building, all these arrangements, we'll start seeing more of them. Then also you'll see competition and floating coalitions between Islamic parties. A lot of competition between themselves or amongst each other, and also floating coalition between Islamists and non-Islamists against Islamists. That's very likely to happen. And fifth, and I hope this is kind of a wishful thinking, issue-oriented. Many of them will become issue-oriented. They will be more specialized, more expertise in specific domains of economy, of society, and so on. And finally, Islamist parties are likely to work within the constraints of the secular states. secular state. This has been, said a long time ago by Asif Bayat, by Olivier Waugh, by Nuaimi, Abdullah al-Nuaimi, by Wael Hallaq, the impossible Islamic state, that there will be growingly until a true revolutionary process, Islamic process takes place. This is what I would like to, I'm sorry to go over time, and I hope Rawan will forgive me for this. And thank you so much for the presentation, for giving me the opportunity to share with you. And once again, thank you for Sharq Strategic Studies for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad, for this comprehensive presentation. And you're covering also a bit like political context and the areas of assessment that the political Islam movements have to address in general to remain relevant in the coming era. Now I have to move to the case studies the task force has addressed. Those are like the countries in which the latest wave of Arab uprisings has happened, in order to examine how the political Islam movements acted and reacted to the situation and the uprisings there. We will start with the chronological order of the uprisings, where Sudan was the first country to witness the protests. And for this, we have Dr. Affan to be speaking to us. Dr. Affan is the acting director of Sharq Strategic Research, and he's also the co-chair of the task force on political Islam at Al-Sharq Forum. Dr. Affan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rawan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Of course, first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Ahmad Shaheen, Dr. Evren Tok for their help in organizing this event. And inshallah, we are looking forward to consolidate more and enhance more our cooperation in all different activities of Sharq Forum. For our task force, actually, I would like to start with this idea that Dr. Ahmad emphasized at the end, that we are witnessing now proliferation of new versions of political Islam. And actually, this is the core idea behind our Sharq program on political Islam. Now we are witnessing and we are expecting massive transformation within Islamic movements. That's why to follow closely what is going on, it's very important. And this task force is the second task force in our program on political Islam to, in an attempt to capture this historic moment in Islamic movements in the region. Our task force simply tried to answer three major questions regarding the case studies of the uprisings of 2019. The first question was about how to map out the Islamic movements in these case studies in Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, and Iraq. And then how did they react to these uprisings, and how did they engage with these protests? And the third question about the impact, the possible impact of these events on the ideology, strategy, structure, the prospect of Islamic movements in these countries. So these were the three major questions that we tried to address in our task force. Starting to go specifically in the case of Sudan, we started the task of mapping the Islamic movements in Sudan was very challenging. And Rawan, if you can present the first infographic. The Islamic movement in Sudan actually, throughout its history, was plagued by this. Yes, did you share it? Yeah, with disputes, with divisions, and that's why to really map out all organizations that represent political Islam phenomenon in such country, it was very challenging. And every time you can see how, for example, in many cases, you can see the many organizations carrying the name of Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And at the eve of the uprisings, there were two organizations carrying the name of Muslim Brotherhood in Sudan. of course, besides the major organizations like National Congress Party and Popular Congress Party and other parties in Sudan. So it was very challenging to map out and the Islamic movement there. We did like an infographic to show, yes, it's there. We tried to trace the origin of the division and sometimes reunity between Islamic movements. But at least at the time of the uprisings in 2019, we had like 4 or 5 major organizations, starting with the ruling party, National Islamic Party, and its affiliated Islamic movement, the National Congress Party, the Popular Congress Party, and the Reform Now movement headed by Dr. Ghairi Salah al-Din, and 2 Muslim Brotherhood organizations. One of them was more active and more engaging with the uprisings, the one headed by Awadallah Hassan, and the last one was the Just Peace Forum, the one that is headed by Tayyib Mustafa, the maternal uncle of al-Bashir himself. So we tried to do this mapping to first to understand what does political Islam mean in the context of the Arab Spring or the uprisings in Sudan. Moving to the second question, how did they react to the 2019 uprisings? And here we can expect that, of course, they behaved differently based on their own calculations. So there was no overarching attitude of Islamic movements toward what is going on. And for example, in the case of Egypt, in the case of Tunisia, the case was much easier because we had Muslim Brotherhood or even Salafists in Egypt or Nahda in Tunisia. They simply belong to the opposition, and that's why they can be categorized as challenging force or challenging power to the incumbent regime. But what happened in case of Sudan, it was totally different. If we can move to the second infographic round, please. We can distinguish 3 different positions in this case. Of course, we had the ruling coalition, the National Congress Party, and the affiliated Islamic movements. And interestingly enough, they were not engaging either, they were not significantly engaging with the events, because for years before the uprisings, they were sidelined and marginalized by al-Bashir, who was more dependent on the military and the security services. So the major decision that al-Bashir took during these events, the National Party, the National Congress Party, they were not involved in the decision making. For example, in February 2019, he decided to announce the emergency law to dissolve the cabinet and the states' governments, and to appoint military officers in all these vacuum or these empty positions. And the leaders of the ruling party, they knew about these major decisions only from media. They were taken by surprise by all these decisions. So the first group of the Islamic movements in such circumstances, the ruling National Congress Party and its affiliated Islamic movements were not involved that much in the events. The second group, the Reform Now movement and Muslim Brotherhood, the faction of Awadallah Hassan, they were part of the government and they were part of the National Dialogue parties, but they rapidly defected from the government only a few days after the eruption of the demonstrations. So Reform Now movement, as appear here in the infographic, they established the National Front for Change on the 1st of January 2019, just like 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the eruption of the uprisings. And Dr. Ghairi Salah al-Din was appointed as the head of this coalition, and also he announced the resignation of all his movement members in the government, and his base joined forces with the people in the street. The same happened to the Muslim Brotherhood, Awadallah Hassan faction. They did the same. They joined forces with National Front for Change, they defected from the government and they clearly asked for regime change. The third group actually was the Coalition Forces 2020, which now became headed by, at that time, became headed by Just Peace Forum, founded by Tayyip Mustafa. And interestingly enough, the Coalition Forces 2020 was established first by Reform Now movement, and it was headed by Ghaya Salah al-Din. But with the beginning of the uprisings, Ghaya Salah al-Din defected from this coalition and established his own group, and that's why Tayyip Mustafa and Just Peace Forum decided 3 days after the establishment of National Front for Change to remove Ghaya Salah al-Din from the leadership of this coalition and take the leadership responsibility. And this coalition was a form of reformist. They acknowledged the demands of the revolution, but at the same time they were against the downfall of the regime. They said, okay, let's have a presidential council in which al-Bashir will remain the president, but we will add some figures from the opposition to manage a transitional period for 2 years. And this initiative, I think it was announced in March 2019. It was supported by the second largest Islamist party in the country, the Popular Congress Party, Travis party, which was headed by Ali al-Hajj. The Popular Congress Party had the same position that, okay, we are supporting the demand of the people, but we prefer to have a more gradualist and more reformist path for this transition. And that's why they announced their support to this initiative. So in short, we can see 3 different groups. The one, the ruling party, National Congress Party, and Islamic movements. Then you have the radical opposition, or the Islamist movements that joined the revolution, the Reform Now movement and Muslim Brotherhood. And in the middle, we can see this reformist Islamic movements, the Popular Congress Party and Just Peace Forum. So what happened after that? This is the important question. After having this mapping of Islamic movements and their interaction with the uprisings, after removal of al-Bashir from power, what happened later? Interestingly, the Forces for Freedom and Change, they didn't distinguish between those who supported the revolution or those who were in power. For them, all of them are Islamists, and all of them should be like marginalized, or should be and shouldn't play any role in the new regime after al-Bashir. So even before al-Bashir stepped down, the Sudanese Professionals Association refused to have Ghaya Salah al-Din and his group within the Forces for Freedom and Change, because for them they just are remnant of the previous regime. That's why Ghaya Salah al-Din and his coalition started to find a way to link themselves with this, with the process through National Ummah Party. National Ummah Party, of course, this is an important and historical party in Sudan. They are middle ground. Of course, they are not technically, or they can't be categorized as political Islam party, because this party belonged to the pre-political Islam era. They belonged to the traditional Sufi movements, which led to 2 major parties in 1950s and 60s, in which dominated the Sudanese politics during 1950s and 60s, the Ummah Party and the Unionist Party. So the continuous meeting and exchange and cooperation maybe between the National Front for Change and the Ummah Party continued at that time in an attempt to keep unity of the all revolutionary forces, either Islamists or not Islamists. But at the end, what happened that the transitional administration, the Transitional Military Council, and Forces for Freedom and Change, they took this decision that we will not have the Islamists in the transitional arrangements. So they just sidelined them, and they started to punish them all. in different ways. Of course, many things happened, like the confiscation of their parties, their media outlets, the dissolution of the ruling party in September 2019, putting them all in trials. And they arrested not only al-Bashir or the first ranked leadership in the National Congress Party, but they went after Ali al-Haj, the head of the Popular Congress Party. They arrested even Tayyip Mustafa of the Just Peace Forum, and even arrest warrant was issued against Salah ad-Din. So this undiscriminating exclusion to the Islamists at that time led to having all Islamist factions closer to each other in a progressive way. They started to respond to the transitional administration in more or less coordinated way. The reformist faction or the opposition faction started to see what's going on is a direct threat to the Islamist presence and ideology in Sudan. So their political positions started to come closer to each other. Although they didn't form any united coalition for all Islamists in Sudan, but you can see gradually their positions and their statements became closer to each other. Not only closer to each other, but also more radical. At the beginning of the transition, you can hear some voices that support some decisions taken by the transitional administration, but with time they become more critical to the transitional administration, and especially when this government started to change the law in Sudan, or to declare that we will have a secular regime separating religion and the state. Even some factions, some moderate factions, started to threaten resorting to violence against what is going on now in Sudan. So, in short, what the behavior and the strategy of transitional administration toward Islamists in Sudan led to two major changes. Number one, push all factions to become close to each other, and secondly, to make them more radicals, even now at the level of discourse and narrative. But we can see maybe in the future a more aggressive action will be taken if the recent agreement that was signed with some factions of the Revolutionary Front in Sudan become consolidated, and if okay, 1 minute, and if this led to establishment of a secular regime. So what about the future? What about the prospect of Islamic movement in Sudan? In short, it depends on the prospect and the unfolding of the transitional process in Sudan in general. If the transitional process led to a democratic or even liberalized form of governance, I think Islamists will retain a significant share in power. Of course, they will not be a ruling power in the near future, but at least they will maintain their presence as effective force in the political scene in Sudan. If this dynamic that's going on now, the weakening of the civilian faction of transitional administration and the progressive strength of the military faction of the transitional administration, I mean, more probably a coup will happen, and this coup, of course, will repress all civilian political forces, including, of course, the Islamist movements, and this could lead to maybe a new deal between the Islamists and non-Islamists in Sudan against the new military regime. The third scenario, given the deteriorating reputation and support for the transitional administration and transitional government now in Sudan, some people started to talk about that. People started to think about the Islamists. They were not that bad, and the now situation in Sudan is much worse than the last days of al-Bashir. So this could give the Islamists an opportunity to mobilize their bases against the transitional administration, or even could lead some Islamist officers to do non-hierarchical coup by removing al-Burhan and Hamiti and took over power again. This scenario is not highly likely, because now the continuous purge are going on now in the Sudanese military, and of course the whole regional and maybe international environment now, with the strong role played by Emiratis and Saudis or the Gulf countries in general in Sudan. They won't allow this chance to happen. But now we have different scenarios. The democratic transformation in which the Islamists will play a significant role, a military coup or the coup from military faction of transition administration against the civilian faction, which will lead to more damage to the Islamic movements in Sudan. Or if odds happen, this could the Islamists could find a chance to be back to power, although the circumstances now in Sudan don't favor this scenario. And thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Affan. We now move to Algeria with Dr. Ismail Aylaji. Dr. Ismail is a professor of political science and international relations at Istanbul Shahir University. He completed his doctoral studies at University of Minnesota with his dissertation titled Performative Socialization in World Politics, Islamism, Secularism, and Democracy in Turkey and Egypt. He joined the faculty of Istanbul Shahir in September 2014 and has served as advisor to the Center for Strategic Studies at the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Islamic Cooperation Youth Forum. Dr. Ismail, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Rawan, and thanks for organizing this wonderful event. University and our friends at Herak. This was a task force that we kept a year, a bit longer than a year. And together with Mohammed Amasha, my co-author, we authored the report on Algeria, the second wave of Arab uprisings in Algeria, and the position of Islamist movements and parties in Algeria. The second wave in Algeria starts in February 10th of 2019, when the aging and ailing President Bouteflika announced his intention, his plan to run for the 5th term in office as president. There were already the protests in 2014 when he announced his plan for running for the 4th term, but it was a relatively small protestation. But this time, it sparked a huge protest wave, which basically just 12 days after he declared his intention, on February 22nd, a massive wave of protests erupted in Algeria, which is called the Herak Protests. The protests that basically aimed in the first place to prevent Bouteflika from running for the 5th term. This was the most immediate goal of the protests, which was achieved. Was in March 30th, the Chief of Staff and also the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Ghaid Saleh, basically announced, invoking the 102nd article of the Algerian Constitution, that the president is no longer entertains the authority to rule as president for medical or other reasons. And this was a dramatic shift of turn of events, because it basically showed that the military, the real power of Algerian politics, basically withdrew its support from President Bouteflika. And seeing that on April 2nd, Bouteflika basically resigned, and he was replaced by the president of the Senate, which basically started the transition period, because immediately the Algerian military, what's called the pouvoir, the power establishment, the Algerian, sometimes referred to as the deep state, Algerian establishment, basically fundamentally the military bureaucracy, but also the civilians affiliated with this military bureaucracy who hold the real power in Algerian politics, the kingmakers of Algerian politics. So basically, they argued now Bouteflika era is over and there would be new elections coming up on December 12th. So this was basically the scenario of, or the background upon which the Algerian Herak unfolded, of Algerian politics unfolded. On the one hand, the immediate aim of the Herak was achieved, but on the other hand, seeing that seeing the huge momentum the momentum is built on part of change. Then there was the protest continued. It basically became a protest of the entire system. That the protesters, the Herak protesters, declared that they are not satisfied with the ousting of the president, but they now want, why we term this, or other writers also term this as the second wave of the Arab Uprisings, is because it bears structural similarities with the first wave in terms of the demands, the reasons that lead to the protests. Basically, almost all of them are quite similar. That the dissatisfaction with the unfair economic redistribution, political repression, denial of rights and liberties. So a demand for social justice, a demand for a better economy, a demand for a fair share in the economy. These are, basically human dignity. All of these are common goals and slogans of these movements. That's why it's very easy to see the continuity between the first and the second one. So the first wave of the Arab uprisings didn't have much effect on Algeria, because Algeria at the time was just 10 years away, just 10 years past of a brutal civil war from 1992, 1991 to up until 2001. So the protests at the time were very weak, very meager. But when we came to 2019, these protests were really massive and produced real mobilized people with real demands, with pressing demands. But the military, the establishment, basically said December 12th is the deadline for elections, and it's going to happen. Now, at that point, both Islamist and secularist opposition in Algeria were basically faced with the question of whether to comply with the military's roadmap or whether to push for a more demanding one. Of course, the military, the establishment, the le pouvoir, were basically willing to control the transition, a controlled transition where the establishment doesn't lose its hold on power, but through some changes, some cosmetic changes, there would be an appearance of responding to people's demands, and then the protests would win, and then the things would go pretty much how it used to go. But the secularist opposition, the secularist part of Herak, I should say, pressed on first changing the constitution. They basically wanted to have a second republic with a new constitution, a new beginning. But that prospect wasn't very appealing for a lot of the Islamist movements on the ground. Some of them, the details are in the report. You can also check the report if you want to get more details about it. But some of the Islamists were basically fearing that a complete rewrite of the constitution would create problems in terms of the Article 2, which declares Islam as the religion of the state. It's in some ways similar to the debates that happened after Mubarak in Egypt. So there was this fear, and some Islamists basically jumped on the bandwagon of the military. They said, "Oh, that roadmap is fine," but some of them especially the mainstream Islamist movements on the ground, moved to, had an oppositional position, a confrontational position with military's roadmap. I will get into the some detail of how Islamist movements were shaped, but of course, to do that in the report, we first give a historical, a short, brief historical analysis of the important things that still cast their shadow on Algerian politics right now. To me, for example, the fact that Algerian anti-colonial nationalism didn't take Islamism as its arch enemy was a very important, very interesting beginning, which was in some ways different from the Ba'ath experience or even later Nasser's experience in Egypt, that it didn't have that confrontational attitude in the beginning. But of course, then in 1960s, we see the first flourishing of establishment of a Muslim Brotherhood inspired movements in Algeria. Qiyam was established in 1963, lasted only up until 1966, with a confrontation with Nasser on Sayyid Qutb's hanging, basically. But of course, the big important issue that cast a shadow to today's politics still is the civil war. The civil war that was very unfortunate, that came after the political liberalization and opening up of the Algerian political system with a new constitution in 1989, which led to establishment of new political parties, which led to an opening up of the political space, in which FIS won the first round of legislative elections. Before the second round, the military intervened, and then the country basically collapsed into a bloody, a decade-long civil war. Now, what is interesting here, of course, in that context, the big question of violence and whether to resort to violence or not, whether violence could be a legitimate means, was a big issue. There were a lot of groups, some of them outside of Algeria, coming into Algeria, like Algerian Afghans, for example, coming all the way from Afghanistan to fight in Algeria. They resorted to violence. But interestingly, the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated groups, they didn't join the civil war. So they basically renounced violence as a legitimate means, way of political change. And that created an interesting situation, because after the civil war, that provided the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated groups a modicum of legitimacy, that they, a patriotism in some ways, that they care for Algerian politics, that they don't resort to violence. But of course, that brings us to the big question when it comes to probably the biggest question when it comes to the Algerian Islamist movements, is the question of whether to cooperate with the regime or not. This is something that Dr. Imad also mentioned alluded to in his remarks. The question of whether to work with the regime or not. This is a very big question. Now, during the civil war, that choice was probably arguably easier, because then you have the option of killing other people for your political goal, whatever they are. But now, after the civil war, Bouteflika comes to power in 1999, and after that, the Islamist parties faced the big question of whether they would lend their support to the regime or they would remain opposition. And if they are going to remain opposition, how confrontational are they going to be? If they are going to get into a cooperation with the regime, through which modality that will happen, on which issues, and how? This was basically a political landscape in Algeria. In Algeria, interestingly, there are two almost independent, geographically separate development of Muslim Brotherhood-inspired political movements. One is Hams, formed by Nahna, and the other is Allah's Nahda. All these movements got into a very serious, and subsequent divisions. We also have an infographic that shows what kinds of splinter groups emerged from other movements. For example, Dawah and Change emerged out of Hams. Then out of Dawah and Change emerged Front for Change. Then Front for Change then reunited with Hams in 2017. Out of Front for Change, Al-Bina came up. So splinter groups are emerging within the movement. Similarly, for example, in Gabalah's Nahda, he was, he himself left Nahda to establish Islah, and then he, in an interesting turn of events, he had to leave himself Islah and form Adala Front, Justice and Development Front. Now, of course, the details are in the report, but the question of whether to cooperate with the regime, for example, whether to support Bouteflika in elections in return for seats, ministerial seats in the cabinet. This was a question that was quite consequential in terms of these internal divisions. So that question still is important, and it is especially important when we come to Herak, when we come to the protests, because now Islamists were, especially the Brotherhood-inspired Islamists, were basically reaping the benefits of being legitimate because they are working with the regime and within the regime, but also having an opposition, a somewhat oppositionary position. But now with Herak, there was a growing sense in Algerian politics that Islamists are also part of the same corrupt system. There were corruption allegations, for example, for some of the Hams ministers in the cabinet. And also some of the Islamists that break up from Hams later on joined the military's roadmap, supported, for example, the current President Tebboune in elections. So we see a very divided, fragmented political landscape. Again, Dr. Imad, I think very nicely put it, proliferation of political positions among Islamists is not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe it shows the vigor of thinking that they are differing on certain opinions. But the negative aspect of it is that they lose their power to mobilize. So they are very deeply divided, which becomes really apparent when you come to the coalitions. There are a lot of attempts, similar to Sudan that Arfan mentioned a few minutes ago. There are a lot of attempts to form coalitions that would bring different Islamists under certain groupings, but to no avail most of the time. They don't succeed in doing that. Even most recently, such attempts didn't succeed after Bouteflika. But
I'm afraid we're running out of time and we need to wrap up.
Just a few seconds. So the relation, what's going to be the relation with the regime, the modalities, the depth of relations with the regime is still very important. Hams, for example, under Razak Mekri moved toward an oppositional position, especially after the first wave of the Arab Uprisings. And currently he's even more pushing toward an opposition. That's an important part. And last point is the question of forming coalitions, not among Islamists, but also reaching across the aisle and reaching out to secularist movements. Because I believe that's ultimately the real popular force that will affect real change. As we have seen, probably we'll talk, much of real change has been stolen. The wind of change has been stolen in Algeria through some cosmetic reforms. I think keeping that is very significant, this secular Islamist coalition. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ismail. Now we move to the case of Lebanon with Dr. Shafiq Shqair. Dr. Shafiq is a researcher at Al Jazeera Center for Studies, specializing in the affairs of the Levant region and the Islamist movement. Dr. Shafiq, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rawan. Also, I would like to thank my colleagues at the Shark Forum and Hamad bin Khalifa University for inviting me to speak in this seminar. In my presentation, I will touch on the role of Islamists in the Lebanese uprising in 3 sections and a conclusion. The first section will be about the uprising itself. The second one is a necessary differentiation between the Islamic group, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, and Hezbollah, given the latter's transformations. The third will be about the role of the Islamic group in the uprising. For the first section and the uprising, protests erupted in Beirut on 17th October 2019 under the slogan "Kullun yani kullun." All them means all of them, demanding the resignation of the government and the departure of the political class, which ruling the country in rotation since the Taif Accords in 1990. The demands of the uprising revolved around 4 basic objectives: the fall of the present government, that time, of course, an interim government for 6 months consisting of technocrats with exceptional powers, the organization of new parliamentary elections, and finally the restoration of stolen assets. The aim of these objectives is to change the current ruling class and to produce a new one in hopes of establishing a new vision of governance, one that will extricate Lebanon from its economic crisis and allow it to recover. Some of the main parties, Lebanese parties active in the regime, stood against the uprising, like the Free Patriotic Movement, Tayar al-Watan al-Hur, which is President Michel Aoun's party, and the Shiite Daw, which are Amal, Harakat Amal movement, and Hezbollah. These 3 are part of the March 8th Alliance. While each of them has its own domestic reasons, Hezbollah accused the uprising of being a mean for Western powers to exploit Lebanon or Hezbollah itself. Other parties expressed reservations and avoided direct confrontation while likely seeking to benefit from the popular movement, as with the future movement, Tayar al-Mustaqbal برئاسة سعد الحريري. Meanwhile, some, though few in number, provided the popular movement with unconditional support, as in the case of Islamic group, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya. In short, those associated with political Islam, namely Hezbollah and Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, had different stances, one with and the other against the uprising. This leads us to the second section about the necessity of differentiating between the Islamic group and Hezbollah. The sectarian difference between the Shia Hezbollah and the Sunni Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya Islamic group did not prevent them from being labeled as actors in the Lebanese and Arab context under the name of the Islamist movement or political Islam, especially in the 1980s and the 1990s. However, this began to change gradually after 2006 as Hezbollah's priority of representing the Shia sect in Lebanon overtook its Islamist role. The peak of this change in Hezbollah was seen after its military intervention in the Syrian war with the sectarian slogans. That is when sectarian differentiation between Hezbollah and the Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya Islamic group became important to them and researchers alike. Moreover, Hezbollah was no longer interested in presenting itself as a part of the Islamist movement, but as a part and extension of the Islamic revolution in Iran, because it is a formula that is more expressive of its ideologies and politics. Accordingly, Iran's transformations as an Islamic Wilayat al-Faqih state that has its own interests and aspirations impacted Hezbollah, its function and its role in Lebanon and the region, especially in the last 10 years. Hence, Hezbollah's position in dealing with the uprising in Lebanon was similar to that of the ruling class, but more aggressive in opposition. Hezbollah even managed to withdraw the Shiite community from the uprising, despite the uprising's keenness to appease Hezbollah, to avoid confrontation, and even gain its support. Regionally, however, Hezbollah's position towards the revolutions is akin to that of Iran. It expressed its reservations in 2011, backed only Bahrain's revolution, favored sectarian policies to deal with the revolutions or confront their implications, especially in Syria, and deems the revolutions as over now. Nonetheless, this does not undermine the fact that Hezbollah maintains an important exclusivity given its status, its roots and the foundations in political Islam remain active despite their relative deterioration, as they are active in resistance, even if only by Iranian standards, although they are inactive in dealing with the uprising. In conclusion, Hezbollah behaved towards the uprising as a sectarian actor that seeks to achieve factional interests in Lebanon, and as a regional actor affiliated with Iran's regional axis and aspirations in the Middle East. Therefore, Hezbollah may sometimes find itself in Islamic group or al-Jama'ah confrontation due to domestic and regional reasons. And it is position towards the uprising is one of them. As for the third section, the Islamic group was the most, Islamic group, Jama'ah al-Islamiyah was the most prominent Sunni political actor that supported the uprising. It is perhaps the only Islamic Lebanese entity that plays an open political role and represents a major segment of Lebanese Sunnis after the future movement, Tayar al-Mustaqbal, led by Saad al-Hariri, but is not part of the ruling class in Lebanon. The Islamic group is ideologized Islamically by classical standards that apply to the forces of what is known as political Islam, political Islam and Islam CSM. Nonetheless, it is politically weak and does not have significant influence in the Lebanese regime or its course. However, because of the sectarian exclusivity in Lebanon, when the Sunni sect and its traditional forces are weak, the Islamic group plays a key role in maintaining the sect, especially during a great political and security crisis. As a matter of fact, the centers of traditional forces in the sect, or what is known as political Sunnism, Sunniya al-Ta'ifiyya or Ta'ifiyya Sunniya, calls on its support as seen in 2008 after Hezbollah took over Beirut and attacked the future movement, Tayar al-Mustaqbal. In addition, the Islamic group is part of the Muslim Brotherhood, at least in terms of intellectual reference and vision, which witnessed political resurgence with the outbreak of the Arab Uprising in 2011. This is a sufficient reason for the Islamic group, Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyah, readiness and unconditional involvement. it saw in the uprising an opportunity to build a state outside the control of traditional political forces ruling since 1990, or to at least allow people the ability to put pressure on the political class to achieve their interests. Consequently, the group pushed its social base and members to participate in the popular movements in all regions of Lebanon, whether as part of larger Lebanese society or in their personal capacity. They did not participate in the name of the group or through its organizational capabilities because they considered the uprising to be a popular mobilization by nature. But the official absence of the group's name in the uprising was perhaps attributed to the Islamic group's fears of repeating the 2011 Arab Spring, which came at a hefty cost to political Islam movements, as in Egypt, in the countries of the revolutions, as in Egypt. The group, the Islamic group, certainly did not want to repeat that experience in Lebanon. In sum, we can make a few observations about the role of the Islamic group, Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, in the uprising and its effect on the latter on it. First, the Islamic group's involvement in the uprising rendered it the foremost mobilizer in the Sunni community, particularly at its peak, which cannot be said about its role in the other sectarian communities, Lebanese communities. This experience placed the group, the Islamic group, on the national map and maybe encouraged local actors to call on the group for help or an alliance in similar circumstances. Second, the uprising also provided the group and its activists with an opportunity to act outside of the organizational framework they are used to and to interact with the wider Lebanese public. During the uprising, the Lebanese public became more accustomed to the group's activists, Islamic groups, activists, participation in discussions and gatherings taking place in public without organizational or jurisprudential restrictions. بدون موانع فقهية in Arabic. This will have long-term effects within the Islamic group, even if no effects can be seen in the short and medium terms. Third, the relative progress of Al-Jama'ah did not reflect yet into a real change in the organizational structure of the community or its modus operandi. Rather, it remains both elitist and religious revivalist in its essence and mechanisms of action. Its margin of political work remains narrow in terms of both practice and thought, where religious proselytization, الدعوة, and charitable activity, الأعمال الخيرية, are the first and foremost functions of the member of the group. Fourth, the social base of the Islamic group, which is one of the political Islam movements in Lebanon, has a nationalist disposition and demands that overtook the traditional ideological priorities that distinguish this trend. In conclusion, the Islamic group was encouraged and advanced during the uprising to become a part of the forces seeking to challenge and revise the ruling order. It surpassed its sectarian identity and Islamist ideology in a rare moment. Now, it is up to it to decide whether what happened was an exception in its history or a transformation it wants to embed it in its vision and institutions and build on. On a final note, political Islam is currently subject to the effects of two revolutions, the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Arab Revolutions 2011-2019. In the first, both political Islam and radicalism were revived. Today, the impact of the Islamic Revolution on non-Shia Islamists may have subsided, but its intellectual and political effects remain despite growing sectarianism in the region. The second revolution, or the Arab revolutions, 2011-2019, had effects that conflicted with those of the revolution in Iran, and the Islamists were part of it. The Arab revolutions caused them to become more moderate and focused on the importance of the state, the rights of citizens, the human rights, the rejection of tyranny, and so on. In the future of the Arab world appears to be doomed by implications of the Arab revolutions, for which the Arab Islamists have allowed for, and this will not end anytime soon. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shafiq. Now we're coming to the last presentation by Tamer Badawi, who's going to be presenting about Iraq. Tamer is an associate fellow with Al-Sharq Forum and a program associate with Med Directions in the European University Institute. Tamer, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, first, Al-Sharq Forum for hosting me in this, and thank you to also the Hamad bin Khalifa University for co-organizing this, and for Rawan also taking care and organizing this event. The case that I will present today is basically the stance of Iraqi, what I call Iraqi Sunni political religious networks and political change in Iraq. Over the last year, since October 2019, there have been protests that started in Baghdad, and these have been aiming at uprooting corruption, corrupt parties, and against human rights violations. Part of the protests have been against, or a substantial part of it have been against pro-Iran political parties and paramilitary groups. These protests have been in majority Shia areas, so in Baghdad, all the way south to Nasiriyah, to all the way to Al-Basra. So this is the curious case of why should addressing Sunni actors should be important. Why is their stance important on these protests? Why I think the purpose is futuristic, is that reading their stance now can give an idea about if such protests spread to Western Iraq and Northern Iraq, that is majority Sunni, I mean, apart from the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So if such protests erupt, then what will be the stance of such actors? This is the answer I'm trying to, this is the question I'm trying to answer. Just to explain why these protests have been confined to Baghdad and central and southern Iraq, and why they haven't spread all the way to Western Iraq, to Al-Anbar, and north to Ninawa and to Diyala, is that Arab Sunnis in Iraq are afraid that protests will bring repression from the federal government. And while these areas are economically fragile, many, according to surveys, saw that recovery since the fall of the Islamic State has been gradual and has been improving. So people are afraid that the relative and small gains that they got in these former Islamic State strongholds will be lost, and also repression will ensue. The second reason is that they're afraid that the protests in these Sunni majority areas and also former strongholds for the Islamic State will lead to an instability that leads to the Islamic State's resurgence. And it occurred before, between 2012 and 2013, in the Anbar protests, that Al-Qaeda has infiltrated the protests. And this has been a very famous episode of radicals infiltrating popular protests. The third reason, and the last one, is that a segment of people in these Sunni majority provinces, they see what's happening in Baghdad as an intra-Shia struggle that they should not get themselves involved in. And also there is a sense that when Sunnis held their protests between 2012 and 13, there wasn't that much sympathy from their Shia countrymen. These are attitudes I understood from reading, but also from interviewing Iraqis that are living in Istanbul. Some of them came following the protests because generally the country became worse and less secure, and some of them are in touch with their relatives inside, so that they have an understanding of what's happening inside. Now, despite that the current protests, again, are not in these Sunni areas or Sunni majority provinces, again, why should the Sunni political religious networks be scrutinized? Well, first, I call them Sunni political religious networks because these actors, they manifest themselves through different institutional vehicles. So have a network of like, for example, a party that has an NGO connected to it, that has a self-declared fatwa council associated with it. So I prefer to call this a network that might not be very cohesive. Rather, actually, these the components of this network can express also different views. So it's not very unitary actor. Again, these networks are not influential in these protests, but however, they matter in the Iraqi political system in different ways. They can be important in critical junctures, in crises, where even the slightest support from them can help shift trends. That, for example, these networks or Sunni Islamists, they can help in parliamentary voting alignments. They can be part of cosmetic inclusion in Shia electoral and parliamentary coalitions. They can be part of religious propaganda in times of conflict. They can be part of wartime recruitment efforts. Essentially, they can be part of inter or intra-communal mediation. Everyone hears me, right? Because I get a sign that the internet is unstable on my side.
We can hear you well.
Okay, perfect. So on the last part, the inter and intra-communal mediation, I think if, for example, if there are protests in the future in Sunni areas, if these actors are trustable enough, such actors can be serve as communication channels between protesters and the federal government in Baghdad. But if trustable enough, so that's why I think how they behave now perhaps matter in the future for how people can perhaps rely on them or not. And it is important to highlight in Iraq on the fact that these Sunni Islamist networks or Sunni religious political networks is that their stances are shaped by their competition on access to state institutions, or let's say rather institutions that can generate revenue. So namely religious endowments. These actors compete on who can have access, because who can have access can have platforms and also can have financial revenue, can also weaponize these platforms against others. I categorize these networks into three. I did not mention this in the paper, but this is rather a new categorization that I created later. Sunni Islamists in Iraq can be, I think, categorized into three. First are networks that are not part of the political process, and they adopt a radical discourse because they're not part of this process. They have the leeway to be radical. An example for this is the Association for the Muslim Scholars, Herak Protests. Since the mid-2000s, they have been chased from Iraq and they have been operating abroad, but they do have a constituency within Iraq. And they explicitly took a very supportive stance on the October protests, because these protests are challenging the pro-Iran parties and paramilitary forces in Iraq. And Herak Protests has there has been a conflict between it and these pro-Iran actors. The second type is networks that are part of the political process, and because of that, they adopt a centrist discourse. The key example for this is the Iraqi Islamic Party, Hizb al-Islami al-Iraqi. They've been in the parliament for a very long time. They have a religious wing that separated from them in 2010. And this wing named itself in 2017 Jam'iyyat al-Adl wal-Ihsan. And there've been actually this NGO for the Muslim Brotherhood has been much more explicit, or I would say relatively more explicit than Hizb al-Islami, than the IIP, in backing the protests. As for the Islamic Party itself that is in the parliament, it was more subtle in supporting the protests. They haven't released a statement. Only leaders of the party that have been expressing some support in TV interviews. The third category of Sunni Islamist actors in Iraq are ones that are not necessarily part of the political process, but they are staunchly aligned with Iraqi actors that are allied with Iran. So these are the ones that I call quietist Salafis and Sufis. Say it in Arabic, Salafiyya Madkhaliya or Sufiyya Samita. And these are represented in three groups in Iraq that I conducted interviews with them in Baghdad in last September, in September 2019. So it's a self-proclaimed Fatwa Council or Fatwa Institute. Its name is Dar al-Ifta. It's headed by a Salafi sheikh. And the second is Jama'at al-Ribat al-Muhammadi. It's a Sufi NGO or association that is based in Anbar in Western Iraq. The third is Jama'at Ulama al-Iraq. They're a Sufi-oriented association. And the three of them are quite anti-change. They're pro-status quo, very pro-establishment. Now, it's also useful to explain that over the course of the protests in 2012 and 13 in Anbar,
I would kindly to ask you to like wrap up so that we move to the Q&A as much as we can.
So how many minutes? Only one? Less?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'm almost done. So these also the stances of these actors have been also have been clear from the 2012 and 13 protests in Anbar in Iraq prior to the rise of the Islamic State. Is that the Islamic Party and the Association for Muslim Scholars, Herak Protests, they've been to varying degrees supportive of the protests. But however, because of this support and because of the rise of the Islamic State, they have been seen as a reason for this destabilization and the rise of radicalism. So they have been marginalized further. The Herak Protests, the Association for Muslim Scholars, they have been actually marginalized for a long time. But the Islamic Party, the Hizb al-Islami al-Iraqi, they have been more marginalized. They had to align themselves more with pro-Iran forces to be able to survive. The forces that were able to gain from this much are the quietist Salafis and Sufis that were against the protest in 2012 and 13, and were very supportive of the Hashd al-Shabi's role in fighting the Islamic State. So they gained support and they gained some access to state institutions. I'm wrapping up here, Rawan. Sorry. Reflecting this, just connecting this to what's happening right now in Iraq, is that all these forces rise and fall with the change of with the intra-Shia changes. The ones that are very close to Iran, like the quietist Sufis and Salafis, now because the pro-Iran forces are under pressure in Iraq, also these forces are under pressure. And now the religious wing of the Islamic Party, the one that separated, actually, now there are signs that they're rising, that they're gaining more influence within institutions. So this is very much also geopolitical, and it's about what's happening in Baghdad. So this is the last word. This is an attempt to foresee how actors, Sunni Islamist actors, can behave in the scenario, which I think is likely, that Sunni majority areas in Iraq will see protests in the upcoming years. I think we should just understand how these actors think, what's their situation now, in order to have a clear image of what's possibly happening in the future. Thank you very much.
And I think on this note of hope and duty, intellectual duty, we will have to end the event today. I would like to deeply apologize for all those whom I could not take their answers. Please do reach out and to Al-Sharq Forum with your questions, and I will make sure that the questions are all responded to. My apologies again, and thank you very much for Ahmed bin Khalifa, for Dr. Iman Shaheen, and for all the researchers and speakers today, and for all those who took the time to attend the event. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very blessed day. Thank you.